It was a chilly early fall night in Sevier County, Tennessee. The air was just cool enough to make people crack their car windows open, turn the radio up a little louder than usual, and believe that everything would be fine. The streets were thinning out. Traffic lights shifted colors unhurriedly. The faint scent of old rain lingered in the air, mixed with the smell of popcorn drifting from the small movie theater at the end of the street. For most people, it was just an ordinary Saturday night in 2008. But for 23-year-old Danielle Kratic, it should have been a quiet ending to a long, exhausting week. Danielle left the theater as the clock edged closer to 11:30 p.m. She stepped into the cold air of the parking lot, phone in hand, smiling after the movie she had just seen. In front of her sat her familiar silver Honda Accord, parked beneath a flickering streetlight. Just 12 more minutes of driving and she would be home. 12 minutes on a road she had traveled countless times, so familiar she could drive it without a second thought. On the way home, Danielle sent her mother a short message, very much her style. "Love you, Mom. See you tomorrow." No worry, no sense of unease. Just a familiar sign-off, like hundreds of texts before it. But no one knew that this would be the last message her mother would ever receive from her. After that moment, Danielle's phone did not power off. It didn't run out of battery. It didn't move. It simply vanished from the system, as if someone had switched off the light in a room, leaving behind a darkness that would stretch on for 11 years. And the question still hangs in the air to this day: what could have happened in those brief 12 minutes? Danielle Kratic was not the kind of person who walked into a room and instantly drew every eye. But if you spent enough time around her, you would realize that some people don't need to stand out to be remembered. Danielle was one of them. She carried a quiet, genuine warmth, something that made others feel at ease without needing a reason. She worked as a receptionist at a small dental clinic in town. It wasn't glamorous work, and it was repetitive day after day, but Danielle did it with a rare kind of care. She remembered patients' names. She remembered who felt anxious in the dental chair. She even remembered the little stories they shared while waiting for their turn. For Danielle, it wasn't just a job. It was how she connected with the people around her. Friends said Danielle was the one who held relationships together. She was the first to text, the one who planned movie nights and cheap meals after work. No matter how tired or busy people were, Danielle always tried to pull them a little closer. She believed that no matter how hard life became, it shouldn't be lived in isolation. Family meant everything to Danielle. She lived close to her mother, close to her grandmother. Every Sunday, she stopped by after church. There were small habits. No one thought much about calling her mom before going to bed or leaving a note on the kitchen table if she came home late. Danielle didn't rush through life. She lived steadily, safely, and fully within simple routines. There were no secrets, no trouble, no signs of someone about to disappear. Danielle had plans for the future, ordinary evenings, modest dreams, and that is why, when she didn't come home that night, everyone who knew her understood one thing: this was not her choice. Danielle did not willingly walk away from a life she loved so deeply. Mountain View Theater was not a modern movie theater. It was small, old, and familiar in a way that felt uniquely Sevierville. The floors were slightly sticky from spilled popcorn. The vending machines rattled with outdated mechanical noises. Faded movie posters hung on the walls, looking as though they had been there for years. But to locals, the place felt safe, an inseparable part of weekend nights. Danielle came to the theater with 2 coworkers after work. She had been looking forward to the strangers for months. While standing in line for tickets, she laughed constantly, retelling the plot she had already read about, teasing her friends that they would be the ones screaming the loudest in the theater. That was Danielle carrying a genuine, everyday kind of excitement. Inside, the lights dimmed. The projector began to hum. The smell of buttery popcorn filled the room. Danielle sat in the middle, reacting openly to every scene. She jumped during the tense moments, laughed when the friend beside her covered their eyes in fear. It was an ordinary, simple evening, with no sign that it would become the final moments of a life. When the movie ended, the audience stood amid the familiar murmur of voices. Everyone hurried out, as it was already late. In the parking lot, the air was colder now, breaths visible under the pale yellow lights. Danielle lingered for a few minutes, saying goodbye, texting her roommate that she would be home soon. She looked completely at his unhurried, unconcerned. One friend later recalled that as they said their final goodbyes, Danielle turned back, smiled, and waved. No one thought it was worth remembering. It was just a very Danielle gesture, gentle, familiar, and so ordinary that no one could have imagined that there, in that quiet parking lot, Beneath the flickering lights of Mountain View Theater, Danielle Kratic was seen for the last time in her life. On the familiar drive home, Danielle moved through the quiet of the late night. Old Newport Highway stretched out ahead, dark and empty, bordered by open land and rows of trees casting long shadows. This was a road she had driven hundreds of times. There was nothing unfamiliar about it, no reason to be alert. Everything remained within the expected order of an ordinary night. At 11:42 p.m., Danielle picked up her phone and texted her mother. Just one short line, "Love you, Mom. See you tomorrow." No emojis, no special message. But to a mother, it was the kind of text so familiar it had become part of daily life, a simple confirmation that her daughter was safe and on her way home. No one knew that this very normal moment would become the most painful of all. Because after that message, Danielle sent nothing else. No call, no follow-up text, no immediate sign of anything being wrong. At 12:07 a.m., Danielle's phone signal abruptly disappeared. It wasn't turned off. It didn't run out of battery. It didn't move to another cell tower. It simply stopped as if it had been cut off from the world in an instant. To those who understand telecommunications data, this was unusual. To a mother, it was the most frightening silence imaginable. Danielle was somewhere on that road, just minutes from home, just a short distance from her familiar bed. But from the moment the signal vanished, time seemed to freeze. No one knows what happened. No one heard a cry for help. No one saw anything out of the ordinary. There was only an invisible gap between two moments in time, a message filled with love, and then a silence that would stretch on for 11 years. Beginning at the exact moment Danielle Kratic disappeared from every connection she had to the world. The next morning began like any other. Pale sunlight filtered through the curtains. The apartment was still quiet. But for Emily, Danielle's roommate, something felt wrong from the very first moments after waking up. Danielle's bed was untouched. The blankets were neatly arranged, with no sign that anyone had slept there. Her work bag still hung carefully on the hook behind the door. The shoes Danielle wore every morning were still in their usual place. Everything was there except one person. Danielle was not the type to come home late without letting someone know. She also never missed work without calling ahead. At first, Emily tried to reassure herself. Maybe Danielle had fallen asleep somewhere else. Maybe she had stopped for a late-night meal. But as time passed, as the clock crept closer to work hours and Danielle's phone remained silent, concern turned into fear. Emily called Danielle's mother, Valerie, her voice trembling as she tried to stay calm. Valerie answered and immediately sensed that something was wrong. She called her daughter. Once, twice, 6 times in a row. Every call went straight to voicemail. There was no familiar greeting. No voice she heard every day. Valerie drove to her daughter's apartment, holding on to a fragile hope that Danielle was simply asleep somewhere. But when she stepped into the quiet room and saw the bed untouched from the night before, she understood this was no longer ordinary worry. Valerie then drove to the parking lot of Mountain View Theater. She stood there in the open space, searching for the familiar silver Honda Accord. It wasn't there. That morning, Valerie called hospitals, tow yards, and finally the police. Each call ended in disappointment. No one had any information. No one had seen Danielle. By late morning, when the official missing person report was filed, the ordinary morning was gone. In its place was the moment a mother realizes that her daughter isn't just late, she has vanished, and no one knows why. Immediately after the missing person report was filed, Sevier County shifted into emergency search mode. For law enforcement, the first hours are always the most critical. Every minute that passes can determine whether someone is still alive or has fallen into danger. But in Danielle Kratic's case, from the very beginning, everything felt different. The first assumption was an accident. Danielle could have lost control of the wheel, veering into a ditch or a low-lying area along the road. That was not uncommon in East Tennessee, where dense vegetation can hide an entire vehicle within hours. Patrol teams began combing the entire route from Mountain View Theater to Danielle's apartment. They searched for skid marks, shattered glass, tire tracks. There was nothing. Old Newport Highway appeared strangely empty, 2 narrow lanes. On either side were abandoned industrial lots, patches of forest, and a small creek. Officers walked in pairs, shining flashlights into every patch of grass, every embankment. Everything was intact, as if Danielle had never driven through there the night before. K9 units were brought to the scene. The dogs picked up her scent from the location of her phone's last signal. At first, the trail was faint but clear. It led the search team a short distance, across the roadside and toward the creek. Then, suddenly, the dogs stopped, not from exhaustion, not from scent contamination. The trail simply vanished. A handler later said it was one of the most baffling moments he had ever witnessed. The scent didn't fade, it ended, as if someone had lifted Danielle off the ground. That phrase spread quickly through the community, planting an unease that was hard to put into words. Helicopters were deployed to scan the area from above. Shallow ponds along the road were checked. Local volunteers joined in, moving through low wooded areas, calling Danielle's name into the air. But when the sun set once again, no vehicle had been found, no personal belongings, no sign of a struggle. By then, the feeling was no longer one of searching. It was like standing before a void, a space too perfect, too clean. As if the night before had completely erased Danielle Kratic's existence, leaving behind only a silent road and questions no one could answer. Immediately after the missing person report was filed, Sevier County shifted into emergency search mode. For law enforcement, the first hours are always the most critical. Every minute that passes can determine whether someone is still alive or has fallen into danger. But in Danielle Kratic's case, from the very beginning, everything felt different. The first assumption was an accident. Danielle could have lost control of the wheel, veering into a ditch or a low-lying area along the road. That was not uncommon in East Tennessee, where dense vegetation can hide an entire vehicle within hours. Patrol teams began combing the entire route from Mountain View Theater to Danielle's apartment. They searched for skid marks, shattered glass, tire tracks. There was nothing. Old Newport Highway appeared strangely empty, 2 narrow lanes. On either side were abandoned industrial lots, patches of forest, and a small creek. Officers walked in pairs, shining flashlights into every patch of grass, every embankment. Everything was intact, as if Danielle had never driven through there the night before. K9 units were brought to the scene. The dogs picked up her scent from the location of her phone's last signal. At first, the trail was faint but clear. It led the search team a short distance, across the roadside and toward the creek. Then, suddenly, the dogs stopped. Not from exhaustion. Not from scent contamination. The trail simply vanished. A handler later said it was one of the most baffling moments he had ever witnessed. The scent didn't fade, it ended, as if someone had lifted Danielle off the ground. That phrase spread quickly through the community, planting an unease that was hard to put into words. Helicopters were deployed to scan the area from above. Shallow ponds along the road were checked. Local volunteers joined in, moving through low wooded areas, calling Danielle's name into the air. But when the sun set once again, no vehicle had been found. No personal belongings, no sign of a struggle. By then, the feeling was no longer one of searching. It was like standing before a void, a space too perfect, too clean. As if the night before had completely erased Danielle Kratic's existence, leaving behind only a silent road and questions no one could answer. As the case slowly faded into silence, there was one person who never accepted it. Danielle's mother, Valerie, refused to let time close her daughter's story. For her, each day without answers was not waiting, it was a battle. Valerie began her mornings with a routine that never changed. She checked her phone, listening for any message or missed call. Even though deep down she knew how unlikely it was, she could never stop. For a mother, hope is not something that can be deliberately abandoned. She called the police department regularly, week after week, sometimes just to ask if there was anything new, even though the answer was almost always the same: no updates, no new leads. But Valerie kept calling. She believed that if she fell silent, the world would forget Danielle. Every Sunday after church, Valerie drove along Old Newport Highway. She stopped at the places police had once searched. She turned off the engine and sat in the darkness, staring into the woods, the empty lots, the places her daughter might have passed through on her final night. Sometimes she spoke aloud, softly calling Danielle's name, as if her daughter could still hear her. Inside the house, Danielle's room remained untouched. The bed was neatly made. Photos still hung on the walls. Small keepsakes stayed exactly where they had always been. Valerie couldn't bring herself to move them. Clearing the room would mean admitting that Danielle was not coming back, and she had never been ready for that. To many people, that persistence looked like obsession. But to Valerie, it was love. She once said that some mothers search because they believe their child is still alive. Others search because they cannot live if they stop. And through all the years the case grew cold, Valerie Kratic remained the single steady heartbeat keeping her daughter's story alive, even as the rest of the world slowly turned away. 11 years had passed since the night Danielle Kratic disappeared. For many people in Sevier County, her story had faded deep into memory. The flyers were gone. The searches had stopped. Life moved on, quietly covering everything with a layer of forgetfulness. But on an ordinary morning in May 2019, the past unexpectedly returned in a way no one could have anticipated. A small pawn shop along Dolly Parton Parkway opened as usual. Nothing out of the ordinary. The owner, Carl Peterson, was sorting through a pile of old electronics when a man walked in. He looked worn down, his clothes dirty, with the appearance of someone who survived by collecting scrap. In his hands was an old cloth bundle, loosely tied. The man placed the bundle on the counter and said he wanted to sell some scrap metal. When Carl opened it, inside were rusty pieces of iron and a few machine parts with no real value. And in the middle of that clutter was a set of car keys. Old, scratched, unremarkable except for the faded black plastic keychain. Carl picked up the keys and turned them slowly in his hand. On the back of the keychain was a faint inscription, nearly worn away by time, Danielle Kratic. For reasons he couldn't explain, the sight made him pause. The man in front of him grew impatient, saying the keys weren't worth anything. Carl nodded, declined the transaction, and let the man leave. When the door closed, the silence inside the shop felt heavy. Carl looked at the keys again. A strange feeling settled in his chest. He sat down at his computer and typed in the name he had just read. It took less than a minute for the results to appear on the screen. An old headline, a face softened by time. The woman who disappeared after a movie in 2008. Carl stood still for a long moment. The keys in his hand suddenly felt heavy. He understood that some moments in life do not allow a person to look away. And that afternoon, 11 years after Danielle Kratic vanished, a phone call was made, a call that would awaken a case that had been asleep for more than a decade. Less than 24 hours after the keys were confirmed, police arrived at the location the scrap collector had mentioned. It was a place almost completely forgotten, hidden behind rows of old warehouses. Weeds grew higher than knee level. Vines wrapped around rusted metal frames, as if nature itself had quietly concealed every trace for years. There was no feeling of an active crime scene, no sirens, no crowd, only a heavy silence settling over the land. Investigators stood still, looking down at a low-lying area where the ground dipped in an unnatural way. This was the spot the man had pointed to, speaking softly, "It's there." An excavator was brought in. The steel blade bit into the ground. Layer by layer, mud and industrial debris were lifted away slowly. No one spoke. Everyone understood that if what they were about to find was real, then 11 years had passed in meaningless waiting for one family. And if it wasn't, the fragile hope that had just been rekindled would be extinguished once again. Then came the sound of metal striking metal. Not loud, but enough to make everyone stop. Beneath the brown soil and industrial waste, the frame of a vehicle emerged, twisted, compressed, nearly unrecognizable. But the dull silver paint, eaten away by time and earth, was still unmistakable. The car was revealed bit by bit, as if it were trying to surface after years of burial. There were no license plates, no clear identifying marks. But for investigators who had worked the case since 2008, no further confirmation was needed. They knew exactly what they were looking at. Inside the vehicle, everything was nearly decomposed. The seats were torn. Fabric was tangled in bent metal, faded and frayed, saturated with the smell of damp earth and engine oil. Near the center console, amid dried mud and scattered debris, a small object was found, a gold earring. Small, simple, and only one. It was placed into an evidence bag and sent directly to the lab. The days waiting for results passed in tension. For police, it was evidence. For Valerie, it was 11 years of hope and fear condensed into a single moment. When the DNA results came back, there was no longer any doubt. The biological material on the earring matched Danielle Kratic's DNA with near absolute certainty. The buried car belonged to her. Danielle had been there for 11 years, just a few miles from where her phone signal had last disappeared. The news spread through Sevier County like an undercurrent, quiet but heavy. For the Kratic family, it was both painful and relieving. The truth had finally surfaced. Danielle had not vanished into thin air. She had been deliberately hidden beneath layers of earth and time's neglect, and from the moment the car was pulled from the ground, the case was no longer an unanswered question. It had become a confirmed tragedy, late, but undeniable. When Danielle's car was pulled from the ground, the biggest question was no longer what had happened, but who had done it. And for the first time in 11 years, the name of a specific person began to emerge from the shadows: Eric Sutter. To many people in Sevier County, the name meant nothing. He wasn't a known criminal, not a face that had ever appeared in headlines. Eric Sutter was the kind of man you could pass on the street without remembering, a middle-aged figure living quietly, doing odd jobs, existing on the edges of the community. But as investigators reopened old files, scattered pieces suddenly connected in a chilling way. The land where the Honda had been buried had once been under Eric Sutter's control. Before 2005, he operated a small towing and scrap business there, the exact kind of place where a car could be hidden without raising questions. After the business closed, the property was abandoned, slowly turning into a true industrial dumping ground. More importantly, in 2008, Eric Sutter worked part-time in maintenance at Mountain View Theater, the very place where Danielle was last seen. He had access to the back areas, a reason to stay late, the ability to observe the parking lot as the crowd thinned out. Internal reports were pulled back out. In early 2008, at least 3 female theater employees had complained about Eric Sutter's behavior. They said he often lingered in the parking lot, made comments that made them uncomfortable, and sometimes followed them after their shifts. At the time, theater management only warned him and reduced his hours. There was no formal documentation, no serious disciplinary action. One former employee, who spoke up years later, recalled that on the night Danielle disappeared, she saw Eric Sutter standing near the back of the theater, smoking, quietly watching people leave. At the time, no one thought it was worth noting. Mountain View was familiar, Eric Sutter was familiar, and that very familiarity allowed everything to be overlooked. When investigators reconstructed the timeline, it became frighteningly logical. A man who knew the theater, knew closing routines, knew Danielle's route home, had the means, the skills, and the space to hide a vehicle, and most importantly had the opportunity. But just as Eric Sutter was identified as the primary suspect, the harshest truth came to light. He had died in 2014, a heart attack alone in his aging home. No confession, no interrogation, no trial. The one person who could have told the full truth had taken it to the grave. For police, it was a reasonable conclusion. For Valerie, it was another cut into a wound that had never healed. Knowing who may have harmed her daughter, but never hearing an admission. Never seeing justice carried out. Eric Sutter didn't just take Danielle's life, he took the final answers with him, leaving behind a truth clear enough to believe, but never complete enough to fully close the case. After Eric Sutter was identified as the primary suspect, investigators obtained a warrant to search the property where he had once lived. The old house itself had been demolished years earlier, leaving only 2 detached sheds standing behind it. They sat in silence, their doors locked, covered in dust and spiderwebs, as if no one had touched them for a very long time. When the first shed was opened, nothing seemed unusual. There were old tools, scrap metal, car parts, the familiar remnants of someone who had once worked in towing and salvage. But when they opened the second shed, the atmosphere changed immediately. It was smaller, darker. And strangely, it was organized with an unsettling sense of care. On a rotting wooden shelf, investigators found an old box labeled in handwriting with a single word: personal. Inside were items that clearly did not belong to a man living alone. Women's wallets, old ID cards, small lighters, sunglasses, pieces of jewelry tangled together, all of them worn with age, yet carefully kept as if they held a value far beyond their original use. As each item was removed, the shed fell completely silent. No one spoke. Everyone understood this was not a collection of forgotten belongings. These were objects that had been taken, kept, hidden like fragments of stolen memories from different women, taken under different circumstances. Then they saw it. A faded movie ticket stub. The Strangers. The showtime matched the night Danielle disappeared. Beside it lay a small gold earring, identical to the one found inside the buried car. There was no longer any doubt. These items didn't just tell a story, they confirmed it. Some of the documents in the box belonged to women who were still alive. When contacted, they said they had once worked at the theater, had felt watched, had lost personal items without understanding how. Those vague memories, once dismissed as overreaction, returned now with an entirely different meaning. To investigators, the shed felt like a silent record of behaviors that had never been stopped. To Valerie, it was the place where she was forced to face the most brutal truth of all. Her daughter was not the only one. Danielle was simply the one who never had the chance to come home. The items were sealed as evidence. The shed was locked once more. But the cold feeling did not disappear. Because sometimes, evidence doesn't just prove a crime, it reveals how many warning signs were ignored, how many chances slipped by, and how many years a truth can hide in plain sight, in silence. When the final pieces were put into place, the truth became clearer than ever. Danielle Kratic had not disappeared on her own. She had been harmed. Her car was deliberately buried. Her personal belongings were kept like trophies, and one name stood at the center of it all: Eric Sutter. But it was also at this moment that the case reached its most painful limit. Eric Sutter had been dead for years. A quiet heart attack, alone in his old home. No handcuffs, no interrogation, no courtroom, no moment of facing the truth. The only person who knew exactly what happened on the night Danielle disappeared took those answers to the grave. For law enforcement, the file could now be closed. They labeled it a homicide with a named suspect, unable to prosecute due to the suspect's death. On paper, it was a reasonable conclusion. But for Danielle's family, it was not justice. It was truth delivered far too late. Valerie listened to everything in silence. There were no loud sobs, no explosive anger, only a long, heavy pause. She had waited 11 years to learn what had happened to her daughter. But she had also been waiting for something else, a confession, a lowered gaze, a punishment. And none of that would ever come. The man responsible had lived freely for years after Danielle vanished. He woke up each morning, moved through the world unrestrained, while Valerie lived every day inside unanswered questions. That injustice cannot be measured by verdicts or case files. It exists in the stolen years not only from Danielle, but from everyone left behind. Justice, in this case, did not arrive with the sound of a gavel in a courtroom. It arrived quietly, too late, and incomplete. And sometimes, the most painful truth is not that we don't know who did it, but that we do, and we'll never be able to ask them why. When the case was officially closed on paper, Sevier County slowly returned to its familiar rhythm. Roads filled with traffic during rush hour. On weekend nights, people still went to the movies, still laughed, still drove home as if nothing had ever happened. But for Valerie, the world had changed forever. She does not call it an ending. Because for a mother, her daughter's story can never be contained within an investigative report. Danielle was not a case, she was a child, a voice. A set of familiar routines in a home that had grown far too quiet, and even though the truth was finally uncovered, the space Danielle left behind could never be filled. Valerie has said that what hurt most was not only that her daughter's life was taken, but that the world nearly forgot Danielle. For 11 years, she fought not just against time, but against forgetting. She believed that when someone is forgotten, they disappear once more, and she refused to let that happen. In Danielle's old room, everything remains as it was. On the table sits a small glass box. Inside is the earring found in the buried car. Valerie does not see it as evidence of a crime. She sees it as a reminder that her daughter was once here, that she was loved, and that she left a mark on this world. Danielle Kratic's story is not just that of a case solved too late. It is a reminder that evil can hide quietly, even in the most familiar places. It is also a testament to the power of a mother's love strong enough to pull a truth buried for more than a decade back into the light. And if there is one message that remains after everything, it is this: time may fade memory, but it does not erase truth. Truth simply waits patiently until someone loves deeply enough, persists long enough, to keep searching. Danielle Kratic could not speak for herself, but because of a mother who never gave up, her story was told. And as long as it is remembered, Danielle has not truly disappeared.